September 1945. A smoke-filled room inside the Third Army headquarters in occupied Germany. Dozens of journalists sit on wooden folding chairs, balancing notebooks on their knees, and holding fountain pens ready. Cameras blink and flash as the routine press conference winds down. Suddenly, a man in the front row stands up, grips his notepad tight, and delivers a highly calculated question. He asks if joining the Nazi Party was just like joining a political party back home in America. The room falls completely silent. A trap has been set, and the speaker takes the bait, offering an explanation that will be stripped of all context and wired across the globe within minutes. But a weaponized headline is a dangerous thing to wield against a commander who knows exactly how to return fire. This is the story of what happened when a reporter deliberately misquoted Patton to create a scandal. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the truth behind the myths of military glory. Corporal Robert Miller was a 24-year-old from Columbus, Ohio, serving in the headquarters company of the Third Army. Before the draft caught up with him, he worked as a linotype operator for a small Midwestern daily newspaper. He knew how stories were set in lead, how ink smelled on cheap wood pulp, and how a careless word could be twisted by an editor looking to sell papers. He had spent the last 3 years carrying field radios through the mud of France and into the heart of Germany. He had lost his hearing in his left ear during the heavy shelling out Metz, an injury that left him with a permanent, slight tilt to his head. His background made him sharp, and his military service made him observant. He was assigned to manage the physical layout of the press room that morning, adjusting the microphones and ensuring the ink pads for the correspondents were freshly inked. Edward Scanlon was a 35-year-old correspondent from New York City, representing a powerful national press syndicate. Scanlon did not wear the muddy wools of the frontline troops. He wore a tailored officer-style wool shirt, custom-made leather boots that had never seen a trench, and a pristine trench coat that smelled faintly of expensive tobacco. He believed that the press was the true ruling class of the post-war world, often telling junior writers that a single column could break a general faster than a division of panzers. Scanlon carried a deep grudge against the Third Army Command ever since he was excluded from an exclusive briefing in July and given a back row seat at a victory dinner. His editor in New York had sent a clear cablegram just 3 days prior, instructing him to secure a controversial statement from the high command. Scanlon sat in the front row, his gold-plated fountain pen uncapped, waiting for his opportunity to strike. The war in Europe had been over for 4 months, but the battle to rebuild a shattered continent was just beginning. Across the American zone of occupation in Germany, millions of displaced persons wandered the ruined roads looking for food and shelter. Entire cities had been reduced to mountains of brick and ash. The old government had vanished completely, leaving the United States military to run everything from water treatment plants to local banks. It was an impossible administrative task for an army trained only to destroy. Decisions had to be made daily regarding which local officials could keep their jobs to prevent complete public collapse. In many towns, the only people who knew how to run the power grids or clear the sewage systems were individuals who had held cards in the old ruling party. Military government officers on the ground faced a brutal choice between total administrative chaos and temporary compromise. High command in Frankfurt issued strict, sweeping directives from comfortable desks, demanding immediate removals without offering qualified replacements. But in the field, away from the political theorists, practical necessity often dictated otherwise. Many mid-level officers chose to look the other way, quietly allowing technical experts to remain at their posts so the lights would stay on. This created a volatile friction between the reality of the field and the politics of the home front. The press corps sensed this tension and hunted for any sign of compromise, eager to turn the logistical nightmare of occupation into a scandalous story for the morning papers. Every public briefing became a political minefield where a single phrase could be weaponized. Inside the headquarters building, the crowded room grew increasingly warm as the afternoon sun hit the glass windows, and the reporters leaned forward to catch the next exchange. Captain James Vance, a 32-year-old public relations officer from Chicago, stood by the wooden podium and scanned the crowded press room. He adjusted his olive drab cap and raised his hands to signal the end of the formal briefing. He announced that the general had covered the logistical milestones and would now take 2 final questions. Edward Scanlon stood up immediately from his front row seat, ignoring the other reporters who had raised their hands. He picked up his leather-bound notepad and looked directly at the podium, a tight smile on his face. He asked if the regional commanders were ignoring the directive to remove all former party members from administrative positions. Vance shifted his weight, keeping his voice strictly professional, and replied that the Third Army was systematically executing the directives as quickly as technical assessments allowed. He noted that complete public infrastructure collapse had to be avoided while the transition took place. Scanlon cut him off before the captain could finish his sentence, asking if that meant the command considered administrative convenience more important than the immediate removal of war criminals. He demanded to know if the army was simply letting fascists run the utilities because it was easier than training clean replacements. Vance replied that it was not a matter of convenience, but a matter of keeping water and electricity flowing to millions of starving citizens. He stated that the local technical workers were being thoroughly vetted by intelligence teams, and that many had joined the old party under extreme duress just to keep their civilian jobs. Scanlon laughed loudly, looking around the room to ensure the other correspondents were writing in their pads, and asked if the American public was expected to believe that excuse. He muttered that it sounded exactly like a defense of the old regime coming directly from an official military spokesperson. He stated that his readers back home would be fascinated to learn that the Third Army viewed membership in a criminal organization as nothing more than a career choice. Vance walked down from the podium, his face turning sharp and tight, and walked directly over to Scanlon's chair. He whispered that the correspondent was deliberately twisting the explanation to manufacture a sensational headline for his paper. He warned him that dishonest reporting during an active occupation could threaten regional stability. Scanlon leaned back, crossed his tailored boots, and told the captain that the press answered to the public, not to mid-level public relations officers. He said he would write exactly what he heard, and that the military did not have the authority to censor a national wire service. He told Vance to go find someone with more stars if he wanted to argue about the front page. Vance realized the situation had escalated far beyond his level of authority. He turned on his heel, exited through the rear security door, and walked rapidly down the corridor to the Chief of Staff's office. The formal report regarding the confrontation reached Patton's desk within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top utility jeep pulled up to the stone steps of the headquarters building, the heavy tires crunching loudly on the loose gravel. 4 polished brass stars gleamed brightly on his rigid helmet liner, and the familiar ivory grips of his dual revolvers rested against his hips. The double doors swung open, and the general walked into the press room unannounced, his boots striking the hardwood floor with an unmistakable rhythmic click. Every single reporter in the room stopped typing immediately and stood up, the sudden silence heavy enough to feel. Patton walked directly to the center of the stage, his eyes scanning the front row until they locked onto the New York correspondent. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on his belt. His voice was quiet, but it carried to the furthest corners of the crowded room. He looked at Scanlon and asked if he had a question about the administrative policies of the occupation. Scanlon cleared his throat, smoothed the lapel of his tailored trench coat, and stated that he wanted to know if the commander believed joining the Nazi Party was just a standard career choice, no different from becoming an American Democrat or Republican. Patton studied him for a second and asked if the reporter had ever read the mandatory conscription laws or the employment decrees issued in Berlin during the previous decade. Sandlin shook his head slightly, smiled at his colleagues, and replied that he did not need to read the foreign statutes because the simple fact of party membership was all the evidence his readers required. Patton asked if the writer believed that a local water technician who signed a registration card under penalty of execution was a war criminal. Scanlon stated that anyone who wore the badge or paid the dues shared the collective guilt of the entire regime, regardless of their specific trade. "You stand here in a dry room with clean clothes because our engineers cleared the grid," Patton said. "You hold a pen and demand total administrative purity from a distance of 3,000 miles, while my men are tasked with keeping millions of people from freezing to death in the mud. You took a technical explanation regarding historical duress and stripped away every single qualification to manufacture a sensational headline for your editors. You believe your press credentials give you the right to subvert military authority and destabilize an active zone of occupation for personal advancement. My soldiers did not bleed across France to hand the administration of this victory over to individuals who refuse to report the truth. You have a choice. You will sit at that table and copy the complete, unedited transcript of the administrative record by hand, or you will face immediate military expulsion from the theater. Decide now." Sandlin looked at the general's cold expression, his smile vanishing as he realized his press card would not protect him. He dropped his gaze to the table, pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward his typewriter, and began to work in absolute silence. Military police officers moved into the front row immediately after Patton finished speaking. Two large sergeants from the 3rd Army Headquarters Guard detail stood directly behind Scanlon's chair, their white helmets gleaming under the overhead lights and their leather holsters unstrapped. They placed a heavy wooden folding table and a standard military issue metal chair in the center of the press room floor, completely visible to the entire press corps. Sandlin looked around at the silent room, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up his fountain pen and his unlined legal pad. He sat down in the wooden chair and began to write, his custom leather boots tucked tightly beneath the low bracing bar. The only sound in the sweltering room was the scratch of his nib against the cheap paper and the occasional rustle of official military documents being placed onto his workspace. The other correspondents watched the display in absolute silence, none of them raising a camera or reaching for a notepad. Althea saw a powerful metropolitan writer forced to document the exact structural reality he had tried to reduce to a headline. Patton stood on the raised platform for 3 minutes, watching the first 5 pages get copied before he turned and exited. Robert Miller returned to Columbus, Ohio, in the spring of 1946, carrying a wooden cigar box filled with his old dog tags and a copy of the press room transcript. He went back to work at the local newspaper, eventually rising to the position of head editor before his retirement in 1984. He died quietly at his home in 1998, having never spoken to his colleagues about the day he watched a General Brake, a national reporter, with a fountain pen. Edward Scanlon returned to New York City in October of 1945. After his credentials were quietly revoked by the theater command, he spent the remainder of his professional career writing short, unsigned local interest stories for a minor sports syndicate, his reputation among his peers permanently damaged by the incident. He refused to write about the European theater for the rest of his life and passed away in a small apartment in Brooklyn in 1976. George Patton was transferred to the paper command of the 15th Army in October of 1945. A desk job that effectively removed him from the reconstruction of Germany. He kept the investigative report concerning the press room confrontation in his personal lockbox until his fatal automobile accident in December of that same year. In his final diary entry, he wrote that he had fought the German army, the mud, and his own high command, but he had finally been brought down by a man with a pen and no obligation to accuracy. Some historians have argued that Patton was his own worst enemy when dealing with the media, pointing to his blunt manner and lack of political tact as the true causes of his downfall. They believe that his inability to understand the power of public relations made his removal from command inevitable in a post-war era that demanded diplomatic cooperation. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that the general was the victim of a coordinated campaign by opportunistic journalists who deliberately sacrificed historical truth for sensationalism. They maintain that his actions in the press room were a justified defense of his troops and the practical realities of the occupation. What is certain is that the structural ledger containing the hand-copied transcript remained in the Third Army archives for decades, a permanent testament to the day a commander forced a writer to document the exact facts he tried to erase. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have forced the reporter to write the truth by hand, or would you have simply banned him from the base entirely? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the truth behind the myths of military glory, make sure to subscribe.